every now and then I have been accused of not paying attention to the time in church. And there's actually a very good reason for that. Growing up, there was a large clock in the back of the sanctuary. And anytime it got close to the time of dismissal, everybody would start turning around and looking at it to let the pastor know, because clearly he couldn't see the ginormous clock on the back of the wall. And so they would begin to give him cues that it was time to go. And if it got really bad, you would have candy wrappers opening, or people would be looking, you know, and so that would, and I did that. And so I've actually been very intentional in not placing a clock in Cornerstone because I don't want you to turn around looking. I know what time it is. But the other part of it is, our worship isn't bound by time. And so often we try to make everything fit in a nice, neat little space. And there have been times that I preached way shorter than I thought I would. No one ever complained. And there have been times when I preached way longer than I thought I would. And if they complained, I didn't hear them. And so I know it's close to 11, but I have amazing news for you today. You don't have to drive anywhere for lunch, because we're having lunch right here. In fact, we've celebrated and worshiped in so many different ways. We're going to continue fellowshipping, which is an act of worship, right afterwards with our potluck dinner. And I think many of you know it. I don't know that Pastor Brian knows it, but this is actually a celebration for Pastor Brian with graduating college. Did you know? You are in church, do not lie. You are in church, did you know?
I did not know.
You did not know. You did an amazing job keeping it a secret. I share that because there are so many ways that we worship, and I talk about Cornerstone being a family. This is one of those ways that we see it. We walk in life with one another. And so I'm going to do my best to not preach real law, but I still want to do justice to the text. And I want to do that for a number of reasons. Number one, the reason the text deserves to be served full. We don't want to rush it just because our bellies are grumbling. I can tell you I can wait an extra 15 minutes. If I'm honest, I could probably wait an extra half hour. I'm not going to go quite that long. But the other reason I want to make sure that we do justice to this text, it is one of my favorite Old Testament passages. And I share that because it is the passage that really started to redefine for me what it meant to be a follower of Christ and how God worked with us. And I had heard this passage a number of times growing up in Sunday school. It was always a little bit troubling, but we would gloss over the troubling parts and just kind of move on to the ending, because the ending is good. So often what we do, when we don't like something, we just kind of skip through it. We're like, oh yeah, that part's there where it's a little uncomfortable, but we leave it. We're actually looking this morning in Genesis chapter 22. It's verses 1 through 14 if you have your Bibles, and we will get there, Genesis 22. We're looking at Abraham as he has received a word from God to take Isaac up and to actually sacrifice him. Believe it or not, this is the lectionary passage for today, which does not intentionally correspond with it being July 4th weekend, but the focus is on freedom, which is what, and it falls into our lectionary passage. And if you look here, when Abram began his walk with God, Abram really didn't intentionally begin a walk with God. Abram, if you read the end of chapter 11, had arrived in a land with his wife, with Lot, and was waiting to die. He was essentially waiting for everything to come to an end. Sarah was unable to have children, so they had a childless marriage, and they knew that everything was going to come to an end with them in chapter 11. And it is into that kind of bleakness that God begins to speak. And he calls out Abram, and he says in chapter 12, Abram, I want you to go to the land that I will show you. Now, I don't know about you, but I've set out on many trips. And when I set out on a trip, I have a destination. I have some place that I'm going, some place that I intend to stop and to live for a while or do some things or at least eat lunch. You know, something. I have some place that I am going. Rarely do we set off and say, you know what, I'm just going to drive and see where it takes me. And even if we do that, we still know that where we're going to return hopefully within that day or the next day or a few days, we know at some point we're coming back home. Abraham says, God, I will go to the land that you show me, packs up everything, and him and Sarah leave. They go. That's a big step of faith, right? How many of you, if you felt God speak with you, would just get up and go because God said to go to the land he would show you? I would say, God, I need a little better than that. I want to put it in my phone. I'd like to know your ETA, estimated time of arrival, right? I'd like to know what I need to bring with me and exactly how long we're going to be there because I've got stuff to get back here. But that's not how God works at all. God says to Abram, go to the land that I will show you. Take everything and I'll tell you when you're there. So that's chapter 12. We see God continuing to work with Abram over the next few chapters. And in chapter 15, verse 6, God is speaking to Abram again. And he begins to tell him that he will have an heir. But Abram doesn't quite understand how that will happen. But he ends up in 15:6, he says, I believe you, God. I believe this. And what the scripture says is this was credited as righteousness to him. And so we see God and Abram working together. God says, do this. Abram responds and says, I believe you. I trust you. I'm going with you. He sets out on this land. Then he says, okay, I believe that I'm going to have a child produced by you, God. And then in Genesis chapter 17, in my eyes, Abram's faith is really put to the test. Because chapter 17 is where Abram entered into a covenant with God. And do you know what the symbolism was? The way it was sealed was through circumcision. If you go back and read Genesis chapter 17, this is where Abram circumcises himself. Can't even say the word. Circumcises himself. And every other male traveling with him. Can you imagine that conversation? Can you imagine, hey, we've never done this, but God told me this is what we're going to do. Don't worry, I'm going first. I would be terrified. And for me, that would surely say, this is a man who's going to follow God anywhere. Some of you guys are looking saying, absolutely. In fact, I'm not sure that I'd have followed that far. It would lay out this image of Abram following God anywhere God says to go. And then we get to chapter 22. Chapter 22 takes us to a little different page. We have this track record of Abraham following, and then we get to chapter 22, and sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. Here I am, Abraham replied. And you've got to think in the back of Abraham's mind, it's got to be, there was nothing worse than what I've already been through. I left the land that I didn't know. I followed along. God promised a child. It hasn't quite happened yet, but hey, I'm waiting. And then we get to 17, the circumcision. He's really stepped out there. And so when God responds in chapter 22, Abram's not in a bad spot. He's like, I can do this. I can follow God wherever God is going to ask. And he responds quickly. Then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. As we read that, our jaw should just about hit the floor. That is not what we were anticipating. This is the child who was promised. This is the one that Abraham had waited for and longed for and hoped for and tried through a couple different avenues to help come about. And all of a sudden, God is saying, take him and give him back to me. Early the next morning, and I put in there, I know it was early, but it probably didn't really end from the day before. Because with something like that in front of you, there's not going to be much sleep. And so early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." That is a tough passage. It is not the warm, fuzzy feelings that we typically think about when we talk about loving God and following God and giving to God all that we have, all that we are. And yet, that is exactly what it is. This one who Abraham had waited for and longed for his entire life. And Abraham was roughly 100 years old by the time Isaac was born. That's a long time to wait. I remember when Jen was pregnant with both of our kids, 9 months was a long time to wait. I kept thinking, when is it going to happen? And then as that date drew near, the anticipation built and built and built. Is it today? Is it today? Is it today? We all know that feeling, right? And imagine 100 years of waiting. Abraham had already said, "God, I love you enough to give up the land that I know. God, I believe that you will provide. God, I fear you enough, I trust you enough to cut off part of my anatomy." And God says, "But do you love me this much?" We look at this, and I grew up in the church, and the story, the way this was then packaged, is, well, God knew what Abraham was going to do, so it was just a test, and Isaac was never really in any danger. And we gave it that kind of Sunday school stamp so that we didn't have to deal with it. I will never forget sitting in Old Testament origins class talking about this, looking at this passage, and the professor said, "Read the text." I read the text, okay, yeah, God tested Abraham, God knew it was all going to work out, we're good. No, read the text. What does it say in verse 12? Oh yeah, that God knew that Abraham wasn't going to do it, no big deal. Jamey, read the text. There are very important words in verse 12. For now I know. Do you know what that means? That up until verse 12, God didn't know. Now we look at that and we kind of, I see some of you like, wait a minute, the hair is bristling. We don't say that. Because we often fall into this mindset that, and we teach that God knows everything that will happen, God understands everything that will happen, and do I believe that God is all-knowing? Absolutely. But when I look at this test, or this text, and I see the test that occurred here, what it reminds me of is something very, very different. God does not create us as puppets. God gives us free will and free choice to do as we see fit. And at any point along the way, Abraham in his life could have said, you know what, God, that's far enough. You know what, God, I followed you from the land I knew to a land I didn't know. That's worked out okay. God, I trusted you when you said you would do this, even though you hadn't, and it took you a long time. God, I trusted you enough to remove some stuff. But God, that's it. That is where I draw the proverbial line in the sand. And we're done. It's not really the happy story, is it? It's actually this story that leaves us a little up in the air as to what's going to happen. And it gives us a picture of a God who doesn't just say, I know everything that you're going to go through, I know everything that you're going to experience, don't worry, it's all good. God actually walks through this with us, is the picture that we get here. Because all the way along, you better believe that God and Abraham were talking. In the moments that Isaac asked, where is the lamb? Those quick prayers. God, what am I going to do? God, I'm trusting you to provide. God, are you going to be there? Because as much as Abraham was worried and caring what he was going through, he certainly didn't want to burden Isaac with it. And so it would be those quiet prayers. God, what are we going to do? How are we going to get through this? And finally, Isaac arrives at this place, and he's looking around. The wood is there, and Abraham, his dad, is building everything and getting ready to make the sacrifice occur. And Isaac says, hey, Dad, where's it at? And Abraham gives us these amazing words. It shows us of his trust level. God will provide. I think about that, and I just said those words when I didn't really mean it. What I meant was, I'll work it out. Anybody else ever said them that way? Because it sounds like very much the churchy thing to say. And you guys know how I feel about saying churchy cliches. I don't like them. Because we say them and we have almost no thought in it. And they really don't help us to grow in any kind of faith step. But I believe that when Abraham said those words to Isaac, he meant them more than he had ever meant anything. To look at his son and to say, I know that God will provide. It is this true step of faith that helped Abram to go a step further than he had ever gone before in his life. Now think about that. He gave up everything he knew. He took his wife and went off to places that he wasn't sure exactly how it was going to go, places that were dangerous even. He made a covenant with God, even though God hadn't delivered everything that he thought God would deliver. And he gets to this spot with Isaac and says, I know that God will provide. One of the things that we begin to take away from this story is that when we say we trust God, we better mean it. We absolutely better mean it. Another part that we take away from this, and that I love, is it reveals the character of how God works with us. And I'm trying really hard to condense this. It seems like I'm chopping around a little bit. I am trying to condense it a little bit for you. It's actually, I know, Ben's out there, you don't even have a watch. It's a story that I actually love to sit down and to work and to spend hours with, and I know we just don't have that kind of time. But it shows us so much about God. Number one, God just doesn't play any games. And I hesitate to make this the happy story and say God's got it all worked out. But what that actually does is it takes God in a light that God's just playing a game with Abram. Let's see how far I can push you. And I really struggle to take that view of God because I don't see God as one who does that. I see a God who walks with us every single step of the way. And so saying that this was just for Abraham's benefit is just a poor argument. It just doesn't work well. Another thing that we take away from this is that this idea that God calls us and speaks to us, but doesn't make us do anything. God does not make Abraham take this journey. God didn't actually make Abraham take any of the journeys that he's on. He invites him. He asks him. He says, go to the land that I will show you. And the implied part in that is that God will go with him. And so even as they are going on this sacrifice, Abraham has learned that God will go with him and that God will provide, and that God is not going to force Abraham to do anything. And so Abraham must be the one who does it of his own free will. I think about that because when we talk about following God in church, we make it sound easy. But is it easy? If God was really, if we were just like marionettes, I don't know if you guys, we don't do much with marionettes anymore and puppetry and that kind of stuff because we have so much cooler things, right? Electronics and all this good stuff. And I love a good video game, don't get me wrong. But growing up, I will never forget, we went to this arts and crafts fair in Katanning. And I was so excited because they had little marionette peacocks. It was a marionette fishing line, and the peacocks were made out of styrofoam balls. They had a little piece of rope that were their legs, and some feathers that were in there. And sometimes Allie reminds me so much of myself because when she sees junky stuff like this, she's just drawn to it. And I was drawn to this peacock. And it hung in my room, I would imagine, for at least 20 years. At that point, the styrofoam was looking a little rough because some of the paint had kind of disappeared or had been replaced with layers of dust, however you want to look at it. But the feet, where it was a styrofoam ball that had been cut in half and then big heavy magnets glued to the bottom so that you could make it look like it walked. Sometimes in church we just give the impression that God is this puppet master and we are marionettes. We just simply do and move and go anywhere God tells us to go. And what we see in this passage is that number one, God never treats us that way. Number two, God never makes us go anywhere that we don't want to go. And it changes the dynamic in our relationship with God, because suddenly I am not one who is forced to go, but one who is invited with the promise, I will be there with you. What makes that so difficult is because it means that every time I choose to follow God, I am saying, I continue to trust you, God. Even when I don't like what you're saying, I continue to go with you. It would be much easier to say, well, I'm here, but I didn't want to be here, but God made me do it. No. I may not like where I'm at, and this may not have been exactly what I picked, but I know God is with me, which then makes it better than being somewhere else without God. And I'm going to do my best to wrap this up, and I'm sure some of you have questions with this, and we'll talk about it again another day, or you can always sit down and talk with me about it if you have some questions. But the final thing I really want you to take away, and it's the ultimate reason that we can trust God in all of this, because this passage shows us that God will not ask us anywhere, will not ask us to go anywhere that God isn't willing to go himself. Now, if you think about this, here is Abraham moving up the mountain. The altar has been prepared. The wood has been placed on the altar. Isaac has been bound. The knife is in the air, and Abraham is ready to lower it when God intervenes and stops him. We move ahead how many years into the future? And we watch Christ, God's Son, beaten, carrying his cross up the mountain. Finally bound to the cross, nailed to the cross. And God actually doesn't stop it. We look at this and we say, how could that possibly happen in either one of those? And they are tough, uncomfortable texts. And what we see is God being willing to go the distance in every situation. God doesn't ask us to go anywhere that He is unwilling to go with us or even on His own. And so then for me, it brings freedom in trusting God. Because I know that there is nowhere that God can ask me to go that He will just abandon me. There is nowhere that God will ask me to go that He is unwilling to go with me. And there is no place that God is really unwilling to ask me to go, or that unwilling to go with me, that God hasn't been before. It's this amazing confidence that we can actually build in this passage, because here we are, God just didn't forget about Abraham and Isaac. God wasn't just playing games with them. God was actually teaching Isaac and seeing for himself how far Isaac was willing to go. And what we see is a man who loved God more than anything else in his life. My guess is that Abraham never looked at God the same after that. And I wish we knew. I wish we had something that would give us the spiritual condition of what Abraham was really thinking internally, and how he wrestled with this, and what happened at the end. But we know that he didn't abandon God after that. And so I want you to think today, I want you to just begin to examine your relationship with God. I want you to begin to work on that and to think about where God is calling you and asking you to go. For some of us, we are still trying to make the decision, should I really trust God with my eternity? Should I really trust that God is who God says He is, and that I can believe God, that God will actually forgive me and loves me and all of these wonderful things? For some of us, we're looking at life and saying, God, I know that You are calling me to something beyond where I have been, and I don't know that I'm willing to go. I've had faith conversations with Jerry ever since I started meeting with him. And it's probably been about a year, and I know I've shared this with you, but time and time again, as I talk with Jerry, my spiritual director, he hits me with the fact that faith never keeps us in the same spot. And the way that works, and the image that I have of this, is that when we are confronted with the choice of trusting God, we're actually stepping to the edge of the canyon. And in my eyes, it's the Grand Canyon, because it's a long way down. And it's a long way to the other side. And that's the vision that I have, that when we come to the point where we're saying, okay, God, do I trust You? We are right there on the canyon. And God is saying, are you willing to take that step and trust that I will be there for you? And the step of faith says, yes, I trust You, and we take that step. The challenge is it doesn't end. The next time God calls us and says, will you take a step? We're now 2 steps from where we started. And then we are 3 steps from where we started. And then we are 4 steps from where we started. And then we are 5 steps from where we started. And it's right around step 5 or step 6 that Wile E. Coyote fell to the bottom of the canyon. And many of us are expecting the same result. I can tell you that God will not pull the Wile E. Coyote on us. That if we are stepping out in faith, and God has called us, then God will support us in that step. And so count the freedom in it. Find the freedom in saying, you know what, I don't have everything figured out, but as Abraham told Isaac, God will provide, even when we don't know the answer. Even when we're not sure how it's going to happen, God will provide. So let's close in prayer. Dear God, we just thank You for this time together today. We thank You for this this worship service where we have experienced so many different aspects of life. We have been able to celebrate communion. We have been able to gather around a loved one while anointing him. We have been able to celebrate with a baby dedication. We have been able to sing music together. We've been able to read your word. We have been able to pray. And God, in a few moments, we will celebrate with our brothers and sisters in you as we honor and recognize Brian's decision to follow you. God, thank you for the way you are with us. Thank you for the way you just call us to continue taking steps, and that you don't just leave us where we are. God, help us to trust you as Abraham did. To trust you with all that we have and all that you have given us. God, help us to know that no matter the situation, you will never leave us nor abandon us. So God, I pray for eyes to help us see you, for ears to help us hear you, and a presence to recognize your involvement. God, thank you for this day.